We'll start the recording. Alright, hi everyone. Welcome to HYDS Pro-Am 2025 Grand Finals. I will be your chair. My name is Jonathan. I'll let the rest of the judges introduce themselves in the order that they appear in the screen.
I'm Wonseok, I'm a panelist.
Jiho Kim, panelist, good luck.
Hi, I'm Clara. Good luck.
Hi, my name is Youngjae Choi, not Lee.
Alright, thank you. So from opening government, we have HYUU. Opening opposition, we have Ointment Jeon. Closing government, we have Seungjae's team. In closing opposition, we also have Weonbin's team. Alright, under the motion, under the veil of ignorance, this house prefers to be born and raised in a world with one global culture. We will now start with the Prime Minister. Hear, hear.
Yeah, thanks to HYDS. Yeah, hopefully I can go to school next year. I know this year. And hopefully before our team. And yeah, I'll start my speech in 3, 2. Because this motion itself is very, very broad. I'd first of all like to frame what we are talking about by this world with one global culture, right? So first of all, we think that if there can be some kind of difference existing because of an environment difference, right? People living in the North Pole or people living in like South Pole probably would not be wearing short sleeves or short pants, right? They will be wearing long sweaters or things like that. And B, we think that the culture that we're talking about in this debate is mostly likely to be about things like music, the beliefs that people have, or like religions or traditions, or how they treat their family, or how they deal with their family, or how they spend their holidays, or what kind of holidays they have, right? For example, if it's talking about Christmas, everyone's gonna share the Christmas, everyone's gonna do Jisoo, like for example, which is like Korean traditional way to treat their dead families, or whether they're going to go to church every weekend or things like that. They're going to share every kind of similar cultural backgrounds, and they're going to have some kind of set culture that everyone is going to share because they're born and raised by a same culture, right? And C, we think that to an extent, they're going to share some kind of cultural or historical background as well. When we understand that the culture itself is something that is built upon the history that we share as South Korean people or as American people in the status quo, we think that to an extent, because of the under the veil of ignorance idea that we can have from the motion, we think that these people are going to share some kind of historical backgrounds or values together. And lastly, we think that culture can develop by this motion as well. We think that culture is not stagnant, it does change over time, right? In the status quo, South Korean culture is far from like the culture of Silla Shide or like Joseon dynasty, right? We have a very, very different culture in the status quo. We think that that basically means that this culture, but the difference here is that compared to the culture in the status quo, which is developed based on the country, it is now going to develop on a global basis, right? People are going to interact together in a global basis, and we think that change is something that is possible in our side. So having that very clear, let's move on to my argument. We're going to prove to you, one, how by having a global culture and a one global culture, this is going to maximize the individual's autonomy and choices. We think that the winning point in this debate is when we compare to you that this society or this world with one global culture itself can provide far better options and far better choices for individuals in the world compared to the status quo, in which the world is stagnant. world has some kind of separated and segmented cultures in which individuals are fighting over their culture and have lack of understanding of each other, right? So number one, we think that the problem with the status quo itself is that there is a clear cultural differences existing, and which is a clear barrier for interaction or individuals to adapt to a different environment. We think that people cannot understand foreigners. They're not just xenophobic to each other just because they hate each other, but one, we think that because it's not just simply because of the physical differences they have. It's not just because they look different or they have different facial colors, but B, we think that it's because of the cultural differences they have. They have misunderstanding caused because of the cultural differences, right? For example, if I say, if like a random foreigner or random American say, 안녕, like hi to an elderly people, that old dude is going to be mad at this white people, right? Because there is a clear misunderstanding caused because of the cultural differences, right? We think that these cultural differences are something that makes it difficult for individuals to adapt to a new environment or adapt to a new society that has a clear different culture from their own. And especially when we understand that this individual was born and raised in the culture that was somewhat like learned from their parents or somewhat above their parents or like their teachers, we think that it's very, very difficult for these individuals to all of a sudden change their culture in the first place. We think that is the reason why without this system of having one global culture, it becomes very, very difficult for individuals to all of a sudden change their culture and adapt in the first place. I have a great honor for foreigners living in South Korea, right? But number two, we think that because of this cultural understanding can only come from the shared culture that we'd like to propose on the opening government. We think that we widen the room for interaction for these individuals because they were born and raised in a same culture in a world that has a somewhat of a shared environment or shared kind of understanding of what you should do as an individual or what you should do in the weekends. We think that this kind of understanding itself provides a larger room for interaction with other people in different environments. They can just simply move to the United States, all of a sudden go on a plane and then work there. They can just go on a plane and meet other people, find friends, find families, or things like that. We think that this is important because compared to the culturally segmented state as the outside would propose, we think that in that world, individuals had a very, very limited options or limited chances in their side, right? Their life itself was determined by what kind of country they were born in, what kind of family they were born in. But on our side of the house, we clearly provide these individuals a key chance for self-actualization, right? They can now finally decide in which side, in which society or in which world they will like to be or in which world they want to work, which society or with which people they're going to work with, right? We think that is the reason why we clearly widen the scope of individuals' chances of self-actualization. But further moving on, we think that this is also important for vulnerable people or minorities in our culture. We admit to the fact that there can be minorities in this culture. For example, if we're talking about, I'm trying to be nice right here. I think that there were clear oppressions existing within South Korea when we're talking about like in Joseon Dynasty where religious groups were like killed because of the fact that they have certain religions. And I'm pretty sure this is clearly true in the past of Western nations. Sorry, I didn't listen to Western history in my high school. I don't know a lot about it. But I'm pretty sure that culture itself, because I think that culture itself is something that shapes people's mindsets. It's very, very difficult to change. That is the reason why in the past, where minorities were clearly oppressed, there was no chance for them to get out of the situation. Because the country itself is small, there was no chance for those individuals to interact with other people. We think that on our side of the house, at least when there is a single culture existing, these minorities can move to another country, right? And meaning that although they will still be a minority in another country, they can still meet other minorities. And we think that they can group each other. This is important because on our side of the house, where the clear number of in the opposition side of the world, where the clear number of minority itself was small in that single culture, we clearly widen that number. This is important because minorities can finally have a say or room or chance for discourse. We think that this is important because now when we understand that culture is something that can clearly develop, meaning that when culture can develop, we at least provide these chances for the vulnerable people to group up together and have a say in our side. Because we believe that all the individuals in the society and in the world should have a chance to self-actualize with the people that they would like to join with, or with the people, or with the nation, or with the environment that they want to live in. We think that it's clearly beneficial that these individuals have a larger chance of self-actualization that is garnered with one single and global culture. I'm more than happy to propose OG.
We thank the previous speaker for that speech. To start the case from opposition side, may we now welcome the leader of opposition. Here.
just a couple words. This is my first offline final. More importantly, this is going to be my last speech delivering representing as HYDS. So yeah, I just want to thank all the people that have helped me along the way because I couldn't have done this alone. The reason I started this was because I didn't have a partner for KIDS yet at the beginning. So Yeon, and then the next generation, which is Haewon, Jun, Kyungbin, and all the other members. I just really appreciate that you've come along to this crazy, like debate addicted person. And also, I really want to thank my partner. We practiced like 15 rounds this winter vacation, and we deserve everything that led us up to this point. I just really want to be, I am just very thankful for those people. Speech starts 3, 2, 1. Before anything, I want to respond to their point on minorities. Because if you are a minority that is oppressed by your culture, and then you move to another country that is also the same culture, you're going to be oppressed by that same culture. So I don't see what the difference is for that minority. And also, I don't, and I'm going to explain why this situation on their side is worse for minorities. So, first thing, I think in any veil of ignorance debate, it is the most important thing for this actor to be risk averse. The reason is that if you are fitting to that situation, or if you are fitting to the society, if you are a rich individual, or if you are part of the majority, on either side of the house, like on either side or whatever decision you make, you're probably going to be pretty well off. But the delta in your difference is when you are not fitting to that society, when you are not a very well-fitting member, when you are not advantaged, when you are disadvantaged by the culture or the world that you select. That is the thing that you should care about. So the most important thing for this debate is for this actor to be risk averse. Before anything, some framing. I think that in this process of being risk averse, the most important aspects of culture that you should care about is not things like media or like pop culture or like, the art that you can consume and stuff like that. The most important consideration here is things like social norms or expectations or the values that are imposed upon you. This is not because art is unimportant, not because that pop culture is completely unimportant in your life, but the impact that it has on you as a coercive force, as a risk factor in this decision making is the largest. So probably things like pop culture and things like that can be a consideration, but the things that will be most coercive to you, like moral values, for example, or how you are treated based on your identity are going to be the most important issues in this debate. And also, I want to frame out things like war and socio-economic issues and like politics and stuff like that, because the incentive for countries to gain resources and have their interests are like symmetrical on both sides. So I don't think the impact of culture has like that much of a delta in that issue. I'm just preempting anything coming from opposing government. Then, what is this risk? How do we identify this risk in this situation? And how do we avoid it? As I said before, the most important risk is that there are coercive social norms, whatever culture that you subscribe to. But the worst harm or the worst risk is not fitting into these social values. What does this look like? Two things. One is on the surface level, where you don't agree with those values. For example, if you are a part of like a very strongly Confucian culture, and you are on the surface level like a very strong libertarian, probably you're going to have a hard time living a life of self-actualization based on your own values. But the second more harmful thing is something when the social culture, or like the culture in that society is directly persecuting and oppressing against things like your identity. For example, if you're born as like a sexual minority, then probably a culture that is very conservative or not open to minority populations is going to be really, really harmful for you. Not just because you can't get self-actualization, because the social institutions and structures will be actively oppressing you and scrutinizing you and ostracizing you from your life. But the second thing, that this is the most important thing in a veil of ignorance debate, is that you don't know which culture that you're going to run into. You don't know if you're going to run into a libertarian culture or a Confucian culture, and you also don't know what kind of person that you're going to be born into. So the greatest risk that you should be afraid of is you being born into a culture that is against your identity that you cannot run away from. Probably government's response to this is to say that, because there's only one culture, everyone will be subscribing to that culture, so there are no issues. Hence their argument about traveling abroad. But there are certain things that are part of your identity that you cannot change even if you're a subscriber to that culture that will hurt you. And this is the greatest risk. Why is a multicultural society better then? I think that multicultural provides the safety net for this risk because there is an existence of drastic alternatives to that culture. And it means that so on the surface level, what this does is that the existence of other values means that you don't feel alone. There are other cultures in the world that respect how I live or how I think, and that in and of itself is a benefit that you can claim. But the second thing is that the existence of drastically different cultures means that even if you live in like a very drastically conservative society, there are necessarily going to be subcultures and minority populations and communities that are based on those subcultures, which acts as a crucial safety net for you as a person that cannot assimilate the best in that society. But even if you don't buy this, even if you aren't born as a minority population, I think it's just an objectively better world when you have a diversity of cultures. Why is this so? Even when you are a majority population, even when you do fit into the culture, there are certain like very bad things about every single culture, right? And like for example, even me, as a Korean man, the most majority population in this country find things that are fucked up about this country. I don't like the fact that there's misogyny. I don't like the fact that there's racism. And I want to fix those things. I want to live in a society without misogyny and without racism. The thing is, every single culture has a certain problem that needs to be fixed. The mechanism through which these problems are solved are not through internal discussion. I think the most effective way in which you solve these different problems and bring these problems to the limelight is having checks and balances from other cultures and having exposure from other cultures. This is exclusively possible with other cultures because internal discussion is simply not enough a lot of the time. This is exactly for the reason that culture is coercive. So probably if there's only one culture and the only people that can talk about this culture are the subscribers of that culture, a lot of the very bad things about that culture are internalized into every single person that is subscribing to that culture, which means that even if there's a minority population, they're not able to talk about these things because things like misogyny, things like racism are internalized into you and you don't have the capacity to actively fight against this. This is why, for example, Joseon only liberalized when the Western forces started coming in. They had drastic access to things like very different ideas. Only the people who are free from the structures of power and free from the internalization of that culture can come in and check and balance against the worst parts of that culture. This is not only applied to minorities, this is applied to just social change and social progression in general. We objectively believe that So at the end of the speech, you should believe two things. One is that if you are a minority, this is the most important thing that you should care about, because at the end of any veil of ignorance debate, the most important thing is you to be risk averse, and the greatest risk is you not assimilating into that culture. And secondly, the society is objectively better because cultural progression and that world becoming better is objectively better on our side through the exposure to other drastically different cultures. Protocols.
We thank the previous speaker for that speech. To continue opening government, may we now invite DPM. Here.
Okay. Before I go on to anything, I need to thank Saijin for coming up with the debate with me. And I thank all the 2 IU members that's here. Yeah. I'll start in 3, 2, 1. We totally agree to the open opposition that once culture is internalized and you are raised in a society that happens, it is very hard to escape that culture or escape your nation because that's the background that you had for your entire life. That's why when we are debating in a cultural motion, what is more important is to talk about how that culture was formed in the first place. What is the culture and characteristics of the culture that you are talking about in the first place? How opening government is conceiving this debate is we will prove you why this culture in the first place is more inclusive, but even if we say that this culture is oppressive for certain people that do not confront, we have a better mechanism to develop and discourse inside that process of developing. Because I think what opening opposition's case is ultimately doing is very much relying on individuals' capability. Maybe you can escape to a different culture, maybe you can escape to a different country, maybe a more liberal person will come to your nation and change your social norms that is existing. That's the solving mechanism in the opposition. I think what firstly opening government provides is that we believe that in both societies, obviously people will be different with each other, and such oppression comes from you being not understanding other people and suffering with interactions that are people with difference. What opening government gives is very simple. A, we minimizes the difference in the first place, but two, even if we have differences, we have more easy mechanism to connect with other people with the similarities that they have. For instance, we say that this world unified culture means that even if you live in the United States, even if you're living in minority, even if you are in the majority that never saw how indigenous people in the Amazon have lived like, you share the same holiday, you share the same experiences, you share the same custom, and you share the similarities that you can find in every single ways of the culture that you had existed. Note that culture is something that also shapes and interacts with people's identity. It interacts with people's beliefs, it interacts with people's religion, and the environments that you are living inside the society. I think that it is quite intuitive to talk about that the government's world is a world where the majority of people can understand or at least connect with the minority of people much more comparing to the status quo. So I think that opposition's characterization that people will have the same discrimination in itself is false, because obviously the most discriminatory people will always exist, but the majority of the individuals that are rational enough to interact with other people and develop their relationships and beliefs and ideology will be still existing, and for those people our society will be a society that has much easier process inside that process as well. But even if we believe that that is not true and this culture is oppressive for the majority of people that is existing in the society, we say that culture is something that is developed, right? We say that as time passes and people's belief changes, the cultural values and beliefs that individuals believe on also changes as that confronts society. Which means that in this process, how people participate and engage with the process in itself is a very important thing. I think that in that process, we say that our process is much more healthier than the opposition because of three reasons. One, I think that when there's one global culture, this means that this culture is prone and exposed to discourses, not only inside your regional or not only inside your communal status, but inside an international status and international challenges that you have. Which means that this discourse is something that is universally universally engaging inside your system, which means that this is, at best, much more inclusive for the society that is living inside the world, because this culture is something that should also be confronting and understandable for people living in the United States and people living in the Amazon. So obviously we say that it is quite intuitive enough for you to say that this will be something that is more easier to adopt than, for example, customs that South Korea had in the Confucius era or the Arabic states are having in the era that is right now. Which means that even if we say that certain things and certain minorities still exist in the society, minorities are also much easier to consolidate with other people. Because in a lot of cases, the reason why you cannot find the person to consolidate with yourself is because your region is very oppressive. You have never saw different people than you inside your community because you're living in the most conservative Arabic states. What happened inside our world is that even if you live inside the society that are maybe oppressive for your case, the person in the United States sleeping in his room also shares the same experience, also find the same society, also see the similar minorities being oppressed and voicing out inside their own nation. Comparing to you seeing an internet news about what's happening in the Arabic states, a same minority existing in your neighborhood is much more easier for those people to sympathize and participate in the discourse in the first place. Which means that our society is not only better inside the first way how to develop, but also when we are changing the society, we have a much healthier process. Before I go on to the direct responses to the opening opposition, is there any from closing?
Yeah, America probably includes a lot of cultures. We say that American culture is not racist.
We say that what a benefit that we also bring is that we also diminish possibilities such as cultural appropriations and assimilations that multicultural society has as the biggest harm inside the status quo. We say that this is also a very important point because inside the current society, what the indigenous and minority cultures feel is having an unwilling assimilation inside the process. I think America's cultural issues directly deal with these issues. When we talk about Brazilians, what they did to the American people, and what Sri Lanka people has done to Tamils, we say that a lot of cultural differences result in the majority culture trying to assimilate and discriminate the minority culture that they have. This also directly takes down opening opposition's point that we can just move on to a better majority culture because that majority culture might be toxic and continuously trying to diminish and appropriate your minority culture that you had to live your entire life within. This gets even worse, and the impact of this is that because your identity and something that was shaped by your own minority culture is now diminishing and disappearing and distorting because of that majority culture, we say that when we say opening opposition standard, that we need to take about the most minimum, most people that are living inside a society that has experienced the most hardships, those people, it is very, very optimistic to believe that this majority culture will always be a savior for you inside an oppressive society. So, now talking about opening opposition. I think opening opposition talks about their own characterization or damages their own tension. They say that we should look at the bare minimum, and then their solvency mechanism against oppressive people is to say that you can change your belief, you can change your culture. Tell you, changing your culture, escaping your country is a luxury. If you're living in the most oppressive and conservative experiences that they call as something that is a bare minimum, it is very hard to escape your whole own community because your economical and cultural and family relationships and backgrounds all stays inside your region. When they talk about the bare minimum, they're talking about the more luxurious minorities that they can just go to United States and maybe confront the baby society. That in itself totally do not suit a minority debate. For internalization, I also said internalization exists in both roles. We say that they are mechanistically, we outweigh them by saying that of course internalization exists in both roles, but we have a better culture at the beginning and a better processing mechanism. Even an impactful, we weigh over them because what we're talking about applies to universal states. Obviously in their state, there won't be a bare minimum conservative state that leaves with a very conservative mechanisms. When we talk about such conservative cultures, we don't believe why that is any better for these people to live inside society. Thank you.
Now to move to the opening half of this debate, may we now welcome Deputy Leader of Opposition. Here.
part will be the most clear and organized part of my speech. I want to say something because this is my first grand final and probably gonna be my last. So first of all, shout out to KDC who are currently dominating this grand final. And secondly, I want to really thank my partner, Yuhyeok, for being such a reliable and supportive partner. And we really practiced a lot, and I'm really glad that we made it all the way to here. And if we lose, I think that's because of our name. But here's a lesson: don't guarantee any worse. Yeah. I'll start my speech on and probably I'll try to take POI preferably from close. Starting my speech in 3, 2, 1. First of all, I want to clarify 2 points in opening exchange, and then I want to highlight one really important point coming from OG, which will gonna be the winning extensions coming from this motion. So first point is about the cultural fluidity. So they said that probably in OG's word we can change more cultures. The cultures are evolving because people are sharing same things. It will gonna be more inclusive, etc., etc. Well, I think it is largely based on the assumptions that just sharing same thing will just gonna largely change the belief or meaning, belief or perceptions that you already have, regardless of the culture. Yes, the culture will gonna affect you, but we've already told you there are other factors. For example, your natural sexual orientation, your natural romantic orientation, etc., etc. Meaning that probably minorities within the same culture are not oppressed due to the lack of connection or shared experiments, because a gay person in Korea who is oppressed currently still celebrates Seollal or those kind of same holidays as OG stated, and speaks Korean, which is the same language, but he is still oppressed just because of the fact that he is a gay. So meaning that just because we share same holidays, share same languages, doesn't really change the oppression towards minorities that are existing under the one universal culture in OG's word as well. And then secondly, I also want to talk about the direction or the form of the changes that can be possible under OG's word. I think this is really limited to a certain extent, because anyway it is a same one universal culture that is shared in their side of the word. I think the direction of the evolution or evolving or change will gonna be really limited. Why so? Because you simply cannot argue that A is good, but at the same time that A is bad, right? So you cannot really argue that gay is bad, but also that gay is good for some reasons, right? Meaning that there are gonna be largely different type and kinds and directions of the discussions going on under their side of the word, meaning that they will never gonna reach to a consensus that they have to really have at the first place. So here's some weighing about the changes. Here's some weighings about changes. First of all, probably they can have common sense when they are having conversations, probably, but I think it doesn't really guarantee the change towards the inclusivity at the first place. But secondly, let's think about the actual impact of the changes, because as I already told you, for example, speed will gonna be largely slower on their side of the word, because they have to make a consensus when they are evolving certain culture. When they want to include the sexual minorities, it will gonna take much more time under their side of the word. Secondly, the extent will gonna be really marginal under their side of the word as well, because unlike the many cultures are existing, unlike there are the conversations between the cultures in OO's word, because they have to take it under one universal norm. I think it is really hard to have that kind of great evolution or great change to the extent that they can actually protect the minority, right? And thirdly, I think that is not really exclusive under their side of the word, because in our side of the word we also have culture, and culture is not really a small thing, and people large people are sharing any different kind of cultures, meaning that if those kind of evolutions can be happening under their side of the word, probably that can be also happen in certain within a a certain culture in our side of the world. So I think their like exclusive impact is really, really marginal at the best. Then secondly, moving on to the point of minority, they said their mechanism is that the individuals or minorities under this one universal culture can consolidate like it much better or much easier. But then I would like to really question that how is it really easier for me as an individual in South Korea can consolidate an individual from United States just because we are celebrating the same holidays, right?
No.
Because I think the reasonable comparative, realistic comparative here is that we have that minority group as a culture, meaning that we have that minority group that the individual minorities can consolidate as like, for example, like regional level or probably like language level or probably like age level or etc. etc. Meaning that actually we have more capability to protect the individual minorities under our side of the world, because me as an individual minority, if I go to like US and meet like another like 2 or 3 like or 100 like people of minority in US, I don't think the group will gonna have that much power to actually protect myself, because in our side of the world there's like 100 of more like benefits, because first we have more certain ground because it is existing as a culture, meaning that it has more power, bargaining power. Probably it will has like the structure of centralized power to protect the people within the culture, and it is actually more. And even though you cannot really believe this kind of naturalistic capability of a culture, it is more important and it is better under our side of the world, because you at least have the sense of belonging to certain culture. Probably I will have a sense of belonging to my sexual minorities culture, even though so I think we can provide the more certain and more effective safety net for the minorities, support the minorities. And actually we proved that why the minorities having the opt-out culture is better. And opt-out doesn't necessarily mean that we are certainly like we are just like suddenly going to US and move towards other countries, but because of the SNS, because of the informations, we can find the network, we can find the culture like group within the SNS and feel the sense of belonging. This is actually the most realistic type of opting out choices that we exclusively have. Then why OO should win this debate? Because we've explained you the most important thing under today's motion is because you are under the veil of ignorance. You don't know how you're gonna be look like. You don't know how the culture is gonna be look like. Therefore, it is always most important to provide you the most choices, the most autonomies and safety net that you can actually self-protect yourself from whatever culture that the OG will look like. Vote for OO.
We thank the previous speaker for that speech. To extend the case for government side, may we now welcome the member for Gov. Here.
Honorable Chair, we believe that humanity is facing unprecedented existential threats that require a unified global response.
Here, here.
Right? We see decentralized development of AI becoming really disruptive. We see external threats like environmental crisis and cosmic dangers as well. However, we believe that culture in the status quo is working as an immense barrier to the progress of humanity. What we mean by this is that we see numbers of physical and invisible wars just because of religions, just because of ideology, right? We see constant genocides and unnecessary sacrifices in Israel. We see China and US making trade wars, which is killing South Korea's economy and so many others. We see hate terrorisms and murders because of culture. We see language, region, and country becoming a barrier which locks people within their small worlds. We believe that this is a tragedy, right? Under a status quo when humanity is altogether facing the biggest threats, because we see the species have evolved and disappeared throughout the past, and now we believe that it is for human, now it is an important part for human to actually get over, right? And we want to actually get rid of the culture and be born and raised in a world with unified culture to actually save yourself. And we want to be concerned about the most important things that we have to be. So how does our world look like here? We believe that without culture, there will not be a tangible or practical idea of nation. Like there might be nations, but it will be just names. But actually they'll have like same language, they'll have same ideology and same norms, right? And there would be minor disagreements. For example, like pop song will be your major culture, but you might not like it so much. But like these things can happen. But we believe that under our case, culture will actually converge to a point where it will actually embrace universal human values. And why is this? And like what do we mean by this? Is that they will respect fairness and opportunity. It will respect human dignity. It will respect human freedom, and also like work for humanity's progress. And why is this? We see this being declared by the UN in the status quo, kept in vast majority of nations throughout the process of human progress. And we believe that actually, as the opening discussed, barrier is the key to unfairness. We think that barrier is the thing that makes unfairness happen. How did elites rise? How did like violent dictators arise? It is mostly because we believe that in a limited region, in a limited social group or society, some people were lucky to have specific resources that made them powerful within their specific region. For example, even if you had so much oil like maybe 2,000 years ago, it would not be any power for yourself. But now because of certain like social region, social and like environmental reasons, you have the power because of the luck. And therefore you expand that power and you use it violently to expand and actually if you succeed in that, then you become the majority, the tyrant. And we think that opening government has nicely and kindly explained to you why barrier is used by the powerful people and weak people are actually locked within the barrier, and the right to move is the right that is exclusively enjoyed by the most luxurious, rich, and powerful people already in the status quo. So having that established, we believe that there is a good ground to assume that with humanity having one culture, so no different history, no fights, and no hatred about other country, we think that under that assumption, we have a good fiat to assume that we'll be working as one team. And will not have segregations or like unnecessary competitions because of religions or so on, ideology or so on. But we believe that actually we as a one team will look at the external threats and we'll have external enemies, which are, for example, environmental destruction or like or AI's threat and so on. Before moving on opening. Yes.
Yeah, Korea acts as a one team, but we also have social issues. So how do you guarantee that Korea as a culture is actually better? You just expand the scale, but it never explains why it gets better.
Okay, we believe that also within one nation or culture there are problems, but we think that the reason we see a lot of problems in South Korea also happening because of different cultures or different ideologies mixed in South Korea. We see political fight and division. We see how people fight within the left wing, right wing, and they cannot make any agreement. We see in the status quo how society is not running because people have different ideologies, right? We think that we assume that we have the right to assume a case where there is no such change, no such difference, I mean. So like no different ideologies, no different social norms or historically different backgrounds. Therefore, we believe that that is less likely to happen. So with that assumption well made, probably by me, I'd like to move on to our team's case about then how we can actually fight the external threats much better. And we're going to divide this by two different external threats. First, we believe that AI. AI is actually is actually posing unpredictable risk to humanity. Mass unemployment, uncontrolled autonomous weapons, and they are causing existential threats. The super intelligent AIs are actually doing so. However, the problem is that in the status quo, AI development is fragmented across nations, unregulated competitions, and countries are racing to develop AI for military and economic superiority because of all the reasons that they have told you, because of their culture, because of the history. They want to win, because of their team, right? And we think that instead of prioritizing ethical considerations or what is really good for humanity, they're actually fighting for the fights, fighting for their identity, fighting for their country, or fighting for their own group. And we think that this causes problems like arms race, like deepfake and misinformation being uncontrolled, and also possibilities of mass unemployment. We see how ChatGPT is much smarter than most of us, and that is very, very dangerous, right? However, with unified culture, then how can we solve this problem? We think that it gets rid of the biggest barrier that divides countries. It gets rid of language, it gets rid of a difference in language, gets rid of patriotism, historical hatred, or unnecessary hurried competition between, like, for example, China and US regarding AI. Rather, we think that humanity will become one team and actually build unified, centralized regulatory body that uses AI to promote humanity. It will make regulations instead of like China making deepfake and actually trying to compete with ChatGPT, but actually it was found out to have a lot of problems, therefore limited in South Korea. These things will not happen. We'll rather have collaborative approach regarding this issue, which will be much better for humanity in general. But secondly, furthermore, for environment and external threats as well, we think that humanity will be more concerned about the long-term survival of the planet, which is currently ignored by a lot of countries because of the cultures, right? Because nations have to fight, because Trump has to make America great again. They're signing out of the Paris Agreement, right? We think that these things will not happen. Rather, the nations, people, and all humanity can work as a team to better up the environment and save yourself, right? Thank you.
To thank the previous speaker for that speech, to extend for opposition side, may we now welcome the member for all. Here, here.
Thank you, KDC. Thank you, Jisoo, for dealing with an old person. All right. The role that we have right now and the cultures that we have right now may not be perfect, but they are beautiful and they are hopeful. And this is the role that we would absolutely prefer to live in under the veil of ignorance. I'm going to talk about two main things. Firstly, I'm going to talk about how this one global culture is going to be terrible. And note, this is important for you to unlock the benefits of being opposition. It is also a direct response to the points from God Bench about how this will give people more freedom or how this will solve global problems. Firstly, note, cultures are not formed by a consensus. People don't decide, I want my culture to be like this. Oftentimes, cultures are formed by the people that have the most power, the most influence over the society. And these mean that these are people that have control over social policy, people that are politicians, people that have the most influence, therefore, or people that own media companies that have the most power over media control or over religion, the ones that have and dominate the power inside the country. Or inside the culture, oftentimes, especially because most cultures already are capitalist, we assume that this one global culture will be under a capitalist system. These are capitalists, the most privileged among the majority that exists in that society. And what does this mean? It means that on their side, they expand this control that the most powerful people have onto a scale that is global on that side, and this is the biggest harm in this round. Where the richest, the most powerful, the most conservative people from the richest and the most powerful, the most conservative countries are the ones that decide this culture. And this is a culture that is also then believed and accepted by everyone across the globe. What does this mean? Notice the implications of this that are incredibly awful. Where, for instance, you are born in an African country as a black individual, and you believe yourself to be inferior because that is the culture that you're constructed into, because that's the culture that you're born into already, that is dictated by the overlords. You're born in a South Korean country as a South Korean, and you believe all the Asian stereotypes about you from the moment you are born, and your culture raises you to believe those things, because that is the culture that is given to you by the overlords. All those things are what you have to defend on that side. They say then, well, opening up, it's like, well, there will be conflicts and misunderstandings between cultures. Note the comparison though. On their side, either they invite those conflicts into that single culture, where people inside the culture are fighting against each other, where they never explain why that's better. But secondly, and perhaps more likely on our side, we think that these conflicts don't happen at all. And that's a problem, because people are obviously being hurt by these cultures. They're being treated as second-class citizens by these cultures, and they don't advocate for themselves because they believe themselves to be second-class citizens. How on earth is that better on that side? They do not explain that. Closing up is like, well, you can go together like, let's all do the Paris Agreement. No, because the capitalists do not want that. The most powerful do not want that. And the moment they take control, you do not unlock the benefit on closing government either. What is the comparative on our side? The cultures are more granular on our side, and obviously this is not perfect, but this is far preferable to what happens on their side. Because firstly, the cultures have more proximity with the people that they influence, meaning that the cultures are more tailored to them. Like for instance, in Ghana, the culture will be tailored towards the Ghana people, not towards not the American culture being applied onto them, and therefore it will care more about them. Talk about prideful of your skin color, being prideful of your identity, these society that you grow up in. All these things are applied on our side and do not apply on their side, where people feel that they themselves are inferior, or their cultures are inferior, their society is inferior. That is the harm. But secondly, people have more say directly over the powerful people that build their culture on our side, because these are people that are more proximate to you as well. For instance, I as a Korean citizen will have more control over what, for instance, like this Korean society has more control over like the things that Seoyoung might do, or like our Korean politicians, in comparison to like trying to control Trump as a Korean citizen. You cannot do that, and that's why oftentimes the cultures will be built better on our side. This is important for a number of reasons. Firstly, people are simply happier on our side. They're happier when they believe in themselves. They believe in the potential of themselves, as opposed to not being able to advocate for themselves in fighting against other people. Fights might sound bad, but they are far preferable to being defeatist and being like believing yourself to be inferior and worse. But secondly, I would argue that it is much better in terms of people finding ways to improve their culture as well, where they have more potentiality to change. Go.
I think because of the exact proximity reason, it will be much more harder for your powerful people to persuade all other powerful people in the world that your indigenous people inside your nation is people that you should discriminate.
You don't need to. Because yes, it is awful that these other countries discriminate against you, but at least you have your own society, you have your own culture that you are grown into, you grow up in, and there is that potentiality or that belief in yourself that exists better on our side. That is just much, much more important. And that's why at the end of this, what's clear is, on their side the benefit is minuscule and it's actually far, far worse. On our side, opening opposition's idea that like you can access more diverse cultures is less important compared to your culture just existing and benefiting you. The cultures themselves being good is a far, far more important and more direct claim in this round. But secondly, the cultures need to be good in order for you to access the benefit of accessing diverse cultures that are better, which means that we unlock the benefit of opening opposition better as well. That's why closing opposition is already winning. But secondly, let's talk about diversity in culture, because I think this is also quite important as well. The first thing I'll note here is that the way in which you achieve diversity in culture and the way you unlock the benefits of growing those cultures and those cultures learning from each other is better achieved on closing opposition as well, for all those reasons that I outlined above. For we explained to you how cultures grow in diverse ways in a way that is different from each other for all the reasons that I outlined, because it is not dependent on the powerful single majority, like the most powerful across the globe, but it's decided by the most influential inside each culture, which is the reason why they grow differently and they have formed different values. Why, for instance, Thailand has a very rich queer culture as opposed to countries that are very homophobic. And the reason this is important is because opening opposition tells you briefly what you can learn from each other. The things that you learn from each other are existent because these cultures are fundamentally different from each other, because they are differently applying to different people, and that is what we explain to closing opposition. And that's why we are able to learn from each culture that has, for instance, different ideas about how to treat women, different ideas about how to treat gay people and trans people, so on and so forth, that other cultures are able to pick up from and learn from. That is why we unlock the benefit of opening opposition better on our side as well. Secondly, note that the most important thing here also is that in a veil of ignorance, you need to be able to see what is the condition of the worst person in life. Obviously, from all the arguments above, living in this one global culture is awful, because the culture is especially awful towards the minority and towards more minorities, where the likelihood of being a minority inside your culture is far, far higher on that side of the house compared to ours, where you might be a minority in the globe, where you might still be a majority inside your own country. That is still a far better bargain as a person under the veil of ignorance. That is why this is preferable. But secondly, the potentiality of moving across cultures is existent and is better on our side, for clearly it is you have more options here. And I think the most important thing here is, yes, it is difficult to move across cultures, and that is a challenge. But the fact of the matter is that on their side, you know for certain when you are a minority everywhere. There is no potential for your life to be better. There's no potential for you to live up to, or for you to hope for you to dream of moving to a different place where you are accepted, because there is nowhere where you are accepted. The hope that exists in the world that is current is far, far more important, and that's why closing opposition wins.
Thank you for that speech. To conclude the government case for this debate, we will now welcome the government whip. Hear, hear.
start. I agree with Weonbin that this culture is created by the most strongest human beings that exist. But no human being is stronger than universal powers and the existential threats that exist. And therefore, that is the reason why this existential threat is more likely the factor that is most powerful in forming global culture as one. We told you why humanity is always facing with an existential threat that is unending. Seoyoung told you the environmental threats that happen, global warming as a cause that is going to that is going to push humanity to the brink of extinction. Second, we also told you things like COVID and all the unending pandemics that always threaten humanity to the brink of extinction. Third, we told you about how AI development lacks significant consensus and regulations that are necessary for us to prepare for social and political institutions that make sure AI does not override human beings and are aligned with best human interests. How is environmental threats critically important in today's debate? Because I think if humanity fails to overcome these threats, it is complete suicide for these human beings to actually be born into these kind of situations if you're going to be always exposed to these kind of threats throughout your life. First, about environmental threats. I think strong individualism in culture or liberty is going to be less likely to care about these kind of global issues like environmental issues and these problems. But strong community values are going to be able to make people and citizens more recycling or feel more responsibility to the sense of responsibility they have to the community. This means that there is, without these kind of consensus, there's simply lack of environmental policies for people to actually agree on parliament whether you should carbon tax these companies or not. People do not have a consensus of whether certain policies should be passed or not. Second means that there's simply lack of cooperation. Even if you do have these kind of certain regulations, some companies or some CEOs will certainly result to pollution, and there will not be a lot of cooperation at the end of the day, which means that one country or company just keeps polluting at the end of the day, decreasing the incentive as a whole for you to engage in these kind of good policies. The second reason is because simply AI revolution threatens humanity, and this is the biggest harm. First is simply that AI is not artificial intelligence, it is alien intelligence in the current status quo. Things like AlphaGo, when he made the move 37 is like the emblem of AI revolution, because it is a move that humanity did not understand, but at the end it was a move that could only beat Isedol and was able to win the best Go player in this planet. This means that AI also started to create encrypted languages that cannot be developed, cannot be decrypted by other AI intelligences or any other form of intelligence. That means that we lose control, and we are losing control of what AI is, what they're actually capable of. This means that AI is made by DeepMind, and when it actually shows agony against humanity, we have no measures to actually prevent AI from having interests that are aligned best with humanity at the end of the day, and that is the reason why this is the threat that AI actually poses to you in the current status quo, and this is the biggest harm addressed in today's debate. But then how does different cultures and ideologies actually lead to different AI trajectories, and why is this crucially bad? The first is simply because people often have different morality measures. Things like the most classical debate about whether you have the body is the center or the soul is most important in human. In some Aboriginal tribes where they believe that the body is most important, are more likely to believe that AI algorithms are not material things and therefore AI should not be granted rights. But if you live in a culture that believes that the mind is more important, it's more likely for you to believe that AI is capable of feeling emotion and having and interpreting human intelligence, and therefore these kind of communities are more likely to give rights and empower and expand the power of artificial intelligence within these areas. But secondly, simply the difference in political ideologies also means that countries like China or Russia are more likely to develop artificial intelligence in ways that are going to use as mass surveillance, things like face recognition of their own citizens or things like that. But in countries like the United States, they're also going to create things like AI military drones or such kind of technology. Now, why is there simply a lack of consensus of artificial intelligence, and why is this bad? The first reason is simply because of lack of regulations that exist. We don't have a consensus of how to regulate AI, or what is the right way to control AI. And therefore, that is the reason why it's hard to pass laws in parliament that precisely control the speed of artificial intelligence, so that ensures that the development of AI is actually to control the speed, to ensure that we have the political and social institutions to make sure that AI is being developed safe and it aligns with the best interests of humanity. But secondly, even if you do have the regulations that exist, some countries may not have such good interests. They may just develop AIs with mass destruction or things like that. It's the often reason why we think that these kind of differences in culture is actually dangerous in order for you to enact such regulations in the first place. What is the weighing of all of these points at the end of the day? After this, I'll take a POI. The first is simply because the opening bench, as a general, seems to talk about minorities. And they talk about how minorities have their freedom to mobility. And this is what also OG talks about. But first of all, it's highly contingent on the fact that you are going to be born as a minority in the first place. So I think this contingency also mitigates a lot of the harms that the opening or other teams talk about. But our extension is not about contingent on this fact. Whether regardless of you're a minority or a majority, as long as you live in this planet, you're also always going to face these existential threats. And the ability for humanity to actually cope with these existential threats is absolutely important for you at the end of the day, regardless of your background. The second reason is because we simply outweigh the harms. Minorities are being oppressed is also a harm, but CG explains that minorities and majorities, everyone will simply be liquidified by global warming or alien intelligence. This means that this is a greater harm than you simply being oppressed or something. I'll take a POI for closing.
Yeah, the capitalists are the ones that love the AI the most at the expense of ordinary people. Why on earth would the culture be decided in a way that is harmful to AI?
I don't really get the POI, I'm sorry. Maybe I drank too much yesterday. I think the way against closing opposition is that they say culture is created by strong human beings. But the reason why this is unimportant, because no human being is stronger than existential threats that exist. That is the reason why you cannot rely on one person to actually create a culture that can actually to do these kinds of things. That's the reason why we think that when a global culture is actually going to be formed, it is going to be catered to you for actually go against these existential threats, these threats that exist, and therefore you're more likely to prioritize things like communitary values. You're more likely to prioritize things like preserving humanity as a whole. And that's the reason why this is going to be likely and most effective in you trying to cope with these kinds of impacts. Secondly, I'm just going to talk about what CEO largely talks about, because they say that there's not going to be a consensus on things like the Paris Agreement because rich people simply do not want that. But first, I would argue that rich people are also influenced by things like culture. Some rich people do not always have a consensus. Some believe that the environment is important. Some people just simply think that global warming is a lie. But if global culture exists, rich people will have more understanding. They will absolutely have more they will be more negotiable and agreeable on these terms. That's why we have simply more negotiations and regulations on this matter. Thank you.
Thank you so much for that speech. To conclude this grand final, we will now welcome the opposition whip. Here we go.
First, thank you, KIDA. It's good to find new people that I actually feel comfortable with. And thank you, KDC. And thank you, Weonbin Na. I really need to give you like a 큰절. I'm learning so much. Okay, with that, I'm gonna start my speech in 3, 2, 1. Clearest, biggest, and debate-winning contribution coming from closing opposition is that we're the only bench that is able to prove this existing deadlock on these 3 benches, that this global culture is going to be good, it's going to be inclusive or simply exclusive. I think opening opposition doesn't prove why this culture is likely to be exclusive by nature, but at least closing opposition is the only that is able to prove this from the very get-go of their entire argument's missing premise, right? What do we tell you? We tell you that because culture itself is formed inherently with a power hierarchy from the very beginning of human civilization, right? Because these people in power decided to control and make this culture in the first place, power dynamics and is inherently unavoidable by its very get-go of this creation of culture, right? So these minority people's cultures, in fact, formed after the majority of the people have created this culture, and these subcultures are formed later throughout as society progresses throughout, right? So 2 things we give you, that global culture has more likelihood of it being not inclusive for the minorities because it is built upon this power dynamic, and 2, this different subcultures are only able to be created after as a society is progressed. So there's a power dynamic and there's a progression is key in terms of culture. Yes.
Power and influential people exist in both worlds. In your world, culture exists as a spectrum, and considering that this is a veil of ignorance debate, why is living under your proximate Arabic leaders better than living under the rich people all over the world?
We'll get into that soon. But still, at the end of the day, rich people will exist on both sides of the world. That's clear. And I think the power dynamic is just a premise that we're able to prove, and it's able to break the deadlock that has been existing on the 3 different benches, right? So with that proven, that OO didn't do it clearly well, I'm going to break into these different clashes. First is about what is the individual's best interest in terms of this motion, right? First, I think OG talks about maximizing individual autonomy, then further contradicts by saying that, oh, creating a uniform culture is going to maximize individual autonomy. I think the sentence itself is very, very contradictory, because how are you removing choices and saying that, oh, we're going to give them more choices to choose and give autonomy? I simply don't think this is true. Closing opposition tells you that autonomy means you give agency for the people to choose into these different cultures, right? Because under the veil of ignorance, when you are born as a minority, you simply cannot find a welcoming, accepting culture that you can actually feel inclusive, right? And culture that you don't get lynched or hate crimes is hard to find, except in a global culture, because we tell you from the very beginning that this global culture itself isn't going to be likely to be inclusive from the very get-go, right? Opening opposition simply states that, oh, you can just immigrate and go find your niche culture, which I think OG does point out that this is a very luxurious characterization, but at least we're able to prove you that because there is a pre-established culture right before you in the status quo, because there's these minority cultures that is existing for religious communities, gay communities, racial communities, that you can simply just find and opt into and feel welcomed, right? It is more likely that you can actually feel inclusive rather than what OO provides, simply immigrating to these different cultures. Yes?
Agency to choose what subculture you want to appropriately join is something that is also a luxury for the people that grew in a family inside your state. And we're talking about that dirt minorities inside a veil of ignorance motion.
But still, you can, at least the fact that there's people out there that you can feel connected to exist on our world, but on your world, it simply doesn't exist because you're under this uniform culture, right, that constantly lynches on these minority people. At least on our side of the world, the fact that there's people out there that you can feel connected to exist, I think that is the biggest difference in our side of the world, right? And second, under the simple clash, that we are able to provide a better comparison of this unique harm compared with OG, on which OO also fails to do so. Opening government talks about how cultural difference causes barriers and misunderstandings, right? We think this harm is highly, highly minuscule, right? Because simply, this cultural difference can be overcome so easily through empathy and the willingness to learn, especially with the status quo, with the access to internet, right? Like, you know you're not supposed to. Like, these white people know how to use chopsticks, right? I think this differences in culture is something that can simply be overcome with the willingness to learn and educate yourself. However, right, and also, closing government talks about the harm of these different cultural differences leading to people creating wars, right? Closing opposition is able to symmetricize this. Why so? We tell you that harm coming from our side is that because you get lynched, right, by these majority of these people, because these majority people are going to constantly discriminate you, the harm that closing government is providing is probably symmetric on both sides, right? But then the unique exclusive harm coming from closing opposition is that you will constantly, as a minority, when you're born under this veil of ignorance, you're going to constantly question your identity because you don't feel belong, right? You simply are going to constantly question yourself and your identity, thinking that, oh, I am bad. Maybe I am like not worth being inclusive, right? So your entire life, you're going to question about your entire existence itself, and you're not going to be able to find a sense of belonging all throughout your life, like a lone scientist in a laboratory study. Okay? So I think from an individual's best interest perspective, I think only closing opposition is able to prove this unique exclusive harm coming from our bench compared to the minuscule harm that is rather either symmetric or very, very minuscule on government's bench as a whole, right? Then, second clash, moving on, is going to be the progression of culture, right? I think opening government talks about, oh, progression is internalized. But simply, if that is the case, we don't think this is likely, because if you're a minority, you're more likely to conform to the social norms. And like, for example, hands, mace, and tail, right? The minority itself is, because they don't have power, cannot rebel, or cannot like internalize to make these different changes. It's more likely that you're going to conform to societal what has already been established, no matter if it is good or bad, right? Opening opposition talks about the, there's a consensus in this culture, and this is going to lead to a progression, but at least Weonbin Na, the GOAT, proves you that there's with a better mechanism that why it is more likely on closing government's side that we're able to provide these different type of diverse cultures that you can feel inclusive towards, right? Closing government's entire case was focusing about how humanity as a team, we're going to focus on environmentalism. AI can be protected with global culture, but then just because a global culture is formed, not all people are going to suddenly become altruistic, right? We don't think this is true because we tell you, still, power dynamics is this. People with self-interest are still going to exist on your side of the world, so we don't see a reason why all of a sudden these people are going to become donating all the money, right? We think because especially this capitalistic behavior with power dynamic is further enhanced on their world, they're not going to share AI, right? It's more likely that these people are going to focus on their technology at the end of the day. So what do we bring? Jesus. CO1 breaks the deadlock of all of these three different teams who are building this premise upon just an assumption with a proper mechanization. 2, we're able to better engage with the government side as a whole while providing a better filling mechanization that the opening side doesn't provide. And 3, identify the harm of each bench about the power dynamics of how the minorities are going to be treated on both benches and the progression in culture as a whole. For this reason, closing opposition. Thank you.
Alright, thank you for that speech. That concludes this grand final. Please cross the house.
너 나한테 악감정이냐?
존나 패네 진짜.